What's up guys, and welcome back. So obviously this is not going to be a video on the VW, and I do apologise for that, but if you've seen my last video then you know that I've been having some paint supply issues, let's just call it. So I'm taking the opportunity to put this little video together to basically answer a few questions that I've had recently. So without further ado, let's get on with it. Now, I have had a few questions regarding the setting up of not just the spray gun, but spray guns in general. And it basically revolves around a couple of comments I've had from people that they followed many online guides, including the one I did a little while back on this gun, and they still cannot seem to maintain they can't maintain the settings on their spray gun. So what I'm going to do is, this video is primarily about not just setting up your spray gun but setting up your compressor, and that is something that is quite important. And several of the spray gun reviews and setup guides that I've seen, they don't cover setting up the compressor. So here we go, let's go and take a look at the compressor now. So basically the general layout of a compressor is going to be about the same regardless. You've got the motor, which is electric powered, and maybe gas powered, gasoline powered, petrol powered, but that just drives a compressor head, and the compressor head is, as it suggests, the actual device that compresses the air and forces it into the tank. Now, basically to stop this turning into a bomb, we have a pressure relief switch, and this is connected to the motor. On a petrol or gas powered compressor, this will normally be a pressure switch which actually cuts off the air to the tank, but we're not dealing with that. We'll just stick with the electric ones because that's what most people are going to have. So the pressure relief valve or switch, what that does is, once the tank reaches a certain pressure, it pops a little thing inside which opens contacts, cuts power to the motor, and that's it. It stops it right there and then. Now, for most compressors, and again, yes, I know there are going to be exceptions to this rule, but the vast majority of compressors that most people will come across, that pressure will be somewhere between 120 and 130 psi. This one, it's about 126. This one cuts out at. Now, as you use volume out of the tank, as your tools consume air, that pressure does then begin to drop. Now, there is a point at which that pressure switch will then reactivate. It'll close the contacts, and that will start the motor again, and it'll bring the tank back up to its maximum pressure. Now, quite often this is around 80 psi. Vast majority of compressors I've ever dealt with, it's usually somewhere around 80 psi that this switch will reconnect. So that is basically covers that. We've got the tank that will run at between 80 and say 130 psi, just for argument's sake. So now that we've got the basics sorted out, let's turn the compressor on and run it up to full pressure. Okay, there we have it. Compressor cut off at about, I think, like I say, it's about 126 psi for this compressor. So when I first began spraying, my initial thought was, well, you just plug the air line straight into the compressor. So right now we have the air line plugged into the compressor and it's run outside. So let's head outside and take a look at the gun. So have our pressure gauge, here we have our gun, let's connect the air. Now instantly you can see air pressure there is way too high. So what we are trying to achieve here is the correct pressure which the gun needs to operate. Now, 126 psi is way too high. So what we're going to do is pull the trigger, dial our pressure back there, just let the compressor cycle for a second. Now, as you can hear, the compressor has cycled back on, which has brought itself back up to its high pressure. But watch what happens when we pull the trigger. Now we had that set at about 30 psi, and now our pressure into the gun is close to 40. This is not an ideal situation, because what is going to happen is now we've got to dial the pressure back down again. And this is a situation that causes a lot of problems for novice sprayers. And I had exactly the same problem myself when I first started painting. I could not dial a gun in. But there is an easy solution for this, and we will go back to the compressor and I will take you through how I set up my compressor for spraying. And it's always worked for me. There may be other ways of doing it. Obviously everybody has their own way, but this is how I set up the compressor and it always works for me. So let's put the gun to one side and go take a look at the compressor. Okay, so we are now back at the compressor. Just turn that off a moment so it doesn't cycle on. The problem we're having is that there is just too much variation in our line pressure to the gun. So there is an easy solution for that, and that is one of these. And this is basically it's a pressure switch. Now this one has got a water filter on the bottom, and obviously it's set up with quick connects because I do move this between home and the workshop. But in many instances this will just be bolted directly to the compressor. So with an inline gauge connected, we now have control over the actual pressure that is going into the line for your spray gun. So if we plug this into there now, what we can do is we can control the air pressure in this line. So ideally we know that this pressure switch cuts in and turns the compressor head on at about 80 psi. So what I like to do is I like to run my line pressure at anywhere between 50 and 60 psi. Now 50 psi is the minimum that I'll run it at, and depending on how much actual air hose I have connected, I will run it up to 60, sometimes 65 if I've got a really long length back at the yard. And the reason for that is you do actually get a little bit loss in the air line itself. So for example, I'm running at about 60 here. If I take that all the way to the spray gun, by the time I get to the spray gun I've probably lost 5 psi. Now what this has accomplished is it's basically isolated the variations in the tank from the actual line itself. So this tank can cycle up and down all day, and this is especially significant if you're using a small compressor where it's constantly cycling on and off. So regardless of what state this is in, whether it's ready to turn on at 80 psi or if it's just ready to turn off at 125, this line will be at 50. Plus you've got the added bonus of a water filter. Now I won't go into water filters too much, but regardless of where you are, you should have at least one inline water filter. I like to have one right at the tank here. If it's really humid, I will also have a second one attached to the gun, but primarily I like to have one main water filter on the tank. So now that we've covered the basic setup here, we can go and set our gun up ready for painting. So now that we are back with our spray gun, we can reconnect it, and straight away you see the much lower line pressure. Now when we set our gun, now watch, when we start spraying and the compressor starts cycling on and off, we should not see any variation in this needle. So there we have it. Line pressure has remained constant, which in turn means our gun settings also remain constant, and any little adjustments we then need to make, we can make it on the gun without having to deal with the issue of pressure constantly changing as we are spraying. So that just takes us to my basic setup for the gun. So this controls the amount of air going into the gun. I never use these. I always use an inline pressure valve. So first thing, I always turn these to max out the amount of air coming in. Again, I want to control it via this, not that. Second, the actual amount of paint. Now this is actually quite stiff because I don't use it that often, but basically paint flow, again I always set that to maximum. Now let's just unplug the airline a moment. So the final thing is your fan. So obviously this screws in and out, but how I like to set it is, just pull it out a little bit, right, pull the trigger and tighten it until you feel some resistance. Now once you feel that resistance, I like to give it just a little turn, and that sets my fan the way I like it. And this is something I do with all my spray guns. So that is my starting point. Once I've got the compressor set, I've got the gun set approximately to how I like it, then I can go and make fine adjustments to dial in for exactly what I'm doing at that particular time. Very basic setup for the compressor and a very basic setup for the gun, and like I said, this is a good starting point. So hopefully that will have helped some of you, and if so, then smash that like button, because that certainly helps me. Anyway, hopefully we'll be back to the camper van next week. Should have paint and everything sorted out by then, so yeah, stay tuned. Take care and have a good one.